Alright. Hello, my name is Jack Snyder, and I'm here today to talk about the case study Apple Eye Problem Subcontractor Worker Issues Bring Negative Attention. First, I would like to start out by giving a brief summary of the case study as a whole. In 2012, the New York Times brought this story to the attention of the public by releasing a story. In short, it was released how Foxconn, a subcontractor of Apple, was shown to have treated their employees and their working conditions. There were many examples of what they did, and some of them far more extreme than others. Some more historically common ways employees have been mistreated here by Foxconn include poor working conditions, extensive hours, low pay, and hiring underage workers. But there are also many examples that are not very common and were very eye-opening. There were multiple reports of employees committing suicide and multiple suicide attempts, as well as the forced use of a poisonous gas, N-hexane. There were 2 reports of explosions at 2 different factories. Lastly, there were reports of punishments for employees that include isolation and push-ups. These are all just egregious ways to treat employees under any circumstances. But to make matters worse, every employee was given an ultimatum. Either they work under these conditions or leave and be out of work. Everything about this situation in these factories was just horrible. When the stories were released, humanitarians were outraged, and immediately much of the public put the blame on Apple. It was very difficult for Apple to redeem their public image, but they worked at it over the coming years. Some ways they did so was initially put all the blame on Foxconn and start campaigns to redeem their public image. They also put counselors and psychiatrists into these Foxconn-operated factories and downplayed the issues as much as they could. It was a really sticky situation for everyone involved. After learning about this case study, there are a few theories of public relations that are very relevant in this case. The first that comes to mind is the situational crisis communication theory. The situational crisis communication theory is a theory that offers crisis response strategies predominantly to save the specific organization's view from the public. Of the strategies that the situational crisis communication theory offers, the rebuilding strategy and the deny strategy were the most apparent. And they are pretty apparent for obvious reasons. The rebuilding strategy is apparent because Apple and Foxconn have a pretty poor view from the eye of the public for the way that they treated their employees. Thus, they needed to rebuild their factories in their view. And they did rebuild in many ways. First, when this story was released, Apple put counselors into these factories to help with as many immediate problems as they could, and as fast as they could, mostly concerning all employees of the factory and Foxconn managers that may run those factories. Next, they launched multiple campaigns in effort to show that Apple and Foxconn indeed who they want the public to believe that they are. Most of these campaigns involved promoting human rights, both in the general public of any country in the world, as well as human rights for their employees and employees everywhere. Apple did in fact downplay some of the mistreatment of Foxconn for obvious reasons. They wanted to preserve their immediate view as best as they could. They then stated that they do hold themselves accountable for corporate social responsibility and work towards that. They launched labor reform movements and moved forward as best as they could. The rebuilding strategy is the most useful strategy for Apple in this situation that the situational crisis communication theory offers. The next strategy that is extremely apparent in Apple's efforts to work towards rebuilding is the deny strategy. I know that the use of this strategy can be very controversial, but Apple is not necessarily wrong for taking this path. Yes, Apple technically is the big company in charge of these factories and how they are ran, but in reality, these factories were run by Foxconn, a subcontractor of Apple. Therefore, Apple put virtually all the blame on Foxconn and vowed to work towards better conditions in all ways for these employees. The deny strategy can be used in different ways. In this case, Apple blamed another party for their crisis, which was Foxconn, which is an interesting way to do it, given these companies more or less work hand in hand with one another. Either way, the blame was put on Foxconn, using the deny strategy effectively for Apple. Excuse me. The agenda setting theory is also pretty apparent throughout the aftermath of this case study. The agenda setting theory is a theory of communication in which organizations communicate with mass media in efforts to affect the way that they are viewed in the eye of the public. Apple did do this, with their actions coming in a pretty sequential order following the release of this story. With everything that they did do came media coverage. If done properly, this theory can be pretty effective in saving the brand. First, Apple pushed for new managers under Foxconn in running these factories. They then put counselors and psychiatrists in these factories to help fix past problems. Then they launched campaigns and labor reforms to work towards the future problems and show that they are working towards fixing these issues. Of course, all their actions getting media coverage. The most important reason is because this shows that Apple was making extensive efforts to fix the problem that Foxconn was essentially responsible for. They used the agenda setting theory fairly effectively to help restore their public image. This case study was very interesting to read about. For one, because I do remember vaguely when this issue came out to the public. It was very eye-opening and talked about everywhere. It was a terrible look for Apple, and rightfully so. This case was all over the news for a decent period of time, making the aftermath much more difficult for Apple to recover. I would say that they recovered pretty well in the eyes of the public. These theories proved to be successful for Apple, especially the situational crisis communication theory. And it was exactly that, a situational crisis. And they pretty much used that theory to a T. There's clearly still speculation from many how well their factories really are run to this day, but that is to be expected, especially when some of the mistreatment of the employees was so serious. This is a really exciting case to read about. Let me know if you have any questions.